Question 1. Compliance review shows that a facility is considering several options for managing its waste streams, including a solvent-based degreasing operation and a plating process. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and best practices for hazardous waste management? Option A. Consolidate all waste from both processes into a single, large drum for off-site disposal, assuming the disposal company can sort it. Option B. Segregate waste streams based on their specific hazardous characteristics, e.g., ignitability, corrosivity, toxicity, and process of origin, ensuring each stream is properly containerized, labeled, and managed according to its classification. Option C. Dispose of all waste in the facility's general trash bins, as long as it does not appear visibly hazardous. Option D. Store all waste in unlabeled containers in a corner of the facility, until a large enough quantity is accumulated for a single, infrequent disposal event. Correct answer is A. Consolidate all waste from both processes into a single, large drum for off-site disposal, assuming the disposal company can sort it. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in hazardous waste management, balancing operational efficiency with strict regulatory compliance. The professional trainer must evaluate different waste segregation and disposal strategies, considering not only immediate cost and convenience, but also long-term environmental protection and legal ramifications. The challenge lies in identifying the most robust and compliant approach among several seemingly viable options, requiring a deep understanding of hazardous waste identification, handling, and disposal regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes accurate identification and segregation of hazardous waste streams at the source. This aligns with the fundamental principles of hazardous waste management, which aim to minimize risks to human health and the environment. By meticulously classifying each waste stream according to its specific hazardous characteristics, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, toxicity, and regulatory definitions, facilities can ensure appropriate storage, labeling, transportation, and ultimate disposal. This proactive approach prevents commingling of incompatible wastes, reduces the volume of hazardous waste requiring specialized treatment, and ensures compliance with manifest requirements and disposal facility acceptance criteria. It reflects best professional practice by embedding environmental stewardship and legal adherence into daily operations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves consolidating all waste streams into a single container for convenience. This is a significant regulatory failure. It violates the principle of segregation, potentially leading to the commingling of incompatible hazardous wastes, which can cause dangerous reactions, fires, or explosions. Furthermore, it makes accurate waste characterization for disposal impossible, leading to non-compliance with manifest requirements and potential rejection by disposal facilities. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for safety and environmental protection. Another incorrect approach is to assume all waste is non-hazardous if it does not appear overtly dangerous. This is a critical failure in identification. Hazardous waste regulations require thorough evaluation, including knowledge of the process generating the waste and potential contaminants. Relying on visual inspection alone is insufficient and can lead to the improper disposal of hazardous materials, posing risks to landfill workers, the environment, and potentially contaminating groundwater. This approach is ethically negligent and legally non-compliant. A third incorrect approach is to dispose of waste off-site without proper documentation or using uncertified haulers. This bypasses crucial regulatory oversight. Hazardous waste manifests are legal documents that track waste from generation to final disposal. Failure to use them, or using uncertified transporters, means the waste's fate is unknown, creating a significant liability for the generator and violating cradle-to-grave responsibility requirements. This is a direct violation of transportation and disposal regulations and an ethical breach of accountability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach hazardous waste management by first understanding the specific regulatory framework applicable to their jurisdiction, e.g., RCRA in the U.S., or equivalent national/regional legislation. This involves a systematic process. 1. Waste characterization. Thoroughly identify all waste streams generated, understanding the raw materials, processes, and potential byproducts. Utilize process knowledge and, if necessary, laboratory analysis to determine if waste exhibits hazardous characteristics or is listed as hazardous. 2. Segregation and storage. Implement strict segregation protocols based on waste characteristics and compatibility. Store hazardous waste in appropriate containers, clearly labeled, and in designated areas that meet regulatory requirements for containment and security. 3. Documentation and manifesting. Maintain accurate records of all hazardous waste generated, stored, and transported. Ensure all shipments are accompanied by a properly completed hazardous waste manifest, signed by all parties involved. 4. Disposal. Utilize only permitted hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, TSDF. Vet transportation companies to ensure they are licensed and compliant. 5. Training. Ensure all personnel involved in hazardous waste management receive appropriate training on identification, handling, emergency procedures, and regulatory requirements. This structured approach ensures compliance, minimizes risk, and upholds ethical responsibilities. Question 2. The assessment process reveals that a proposed infrastructure development project in a region known for its unique endemic flora and fauna is facing pressure to expedite its timeline, potentially compromising thorough environmental impact assessments. As the certified environmental trainer tasked with advising the project team, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with environmental regulations and promote responsible biodiversity conservation? Option A. Suggests that the project team focus primarily on economic viability and job creation, downplaying the significance of potential biodiversity losses as a necessary trade-off for development. Option B. Recommend the adoption of a broad, generic biodiversity offset program that is not specifically tailored to the unique species and habitats present in the project area, citing its cost-effectiveness and ease of implementation. Option C. Advise the project team to proceed with the development as quickly as possible, focusing only on immediate operational permits and deferring detailed biodiversity impact studies until after construction is complete. Option D. Advocate for a phased approach to the environmental impact assessment, prioritizing the identification of critical habitats and species most vulnerable to the development, and propose immediate, targeted mitigation strategies for these areas while the full assessment proceeds. The correct answer is D. Advocate for a phased approach to the environmental impact assessment, prioritizing the identification of critical habitats and species most vulnerable to the development, and propose immediate, targeted mitigation strategies for these areas while the full assessment proceeds. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge for environmental trainers, balancing the immediate needs of a project with long-term ecological sustainability. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the trainer to critically evaluate competing priorities, understand the complex interplay between development and biodiversity, and advocate for practices that align with regulatory requirements and ethical responsibilities. The trainer must move beyond simply delivering information to actively influencing decision-making towards responsible environmental stewardship. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of biodiversity's intrinsic and ecosystem service values, directly linking them to the specific threats posed by the proposed development. This aligns with the core principles of environmental training, which aim to foster informed decision-making and proactive conservation. By identifying and proposing mitigation strategies that address these specific threats, the trainer is fulfilling their ethical obligation to promote sustainable development and comply with relevant environmental legislation that mandates biodiversity protection. This proactive and integrated approach ensures that environmental considerations are embedded in the project lifecycle, rather than being an afterthought. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate project cost savings without adequately assessing biodiversity impacts represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a disregard for environmental legislation that often requires impact assessments and mitigation plans for biodiversity. Ethically, it prioritizes short-term economic gain over the long-term health of ecosystems and the services they provide, which can have cascading negative consequences for both the environment and human well-being. Another incorrect approach that relies on generic, unverified conservation claims without specific evidence or regulatory backing is also professionally unacceptable. It fails to meet the standards of evidence-based environmental management and can lead to ineffective or even detrimental conservation efforts. It also risks non-compliance with regulations that require demonstrable and effective mitigation measures. A third incorrect approach that dismisses biodiversity concerns as secondary to other project objectives, without a thorough assessment of potential impacts, is a direct contravention of the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental law. It demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and an abdication of responsibility to identify and manage environmental risks. This can lead to unforeseen ecological damage, regulatory penalties, and reputational damage for the project and the trainer. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the project's scope and potential environmental interactions. Second, identify all relevant regulatory requirements pertaining to biodiversity and environmental impact assessment. Third, conduct a detailed assessment of potential biodiversity impacts, considering both direct and indirect effects. Fourth, research and propose evidence-based mitigation and conservation strategies that are tailored to the specific threats and regulatory context. Finally, communicate these findings and recommendations clearly and persuasively to project stakeholders, advocating for the integration of environmental best practices. Question 3. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess an environmental trainer's ability to connect ecological principles to regulatory requirements. A trainer is asked to explain how understanding the trophic levels within a local wetland ecosystem, e.g., producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, is essential for developing a compliant stormwater management plan under the Clean Water Act. Which of the following explanations best demonstrates this connection from a regulatory compliance perspective? Option A. Describing the various types of algae and aquatic plants that form the base of the wetland's food web and their aesthetic appeal, as these are often highlighted in public outreach materials for wetland conservation. Option B. Outlining the historical species composition of the wetland and comparing it to current observations, emphasizing the importance of maintaining historical ecological baselines for scientific research. Option C. Detailing the energy transfer efficiency between different trophic levels, noting that a significant portion of energy is lost at each transfer, which is a fundamental concept in ecosystem energetics. Option D. Explaining how disruptions to the food web, such as the decline of a key invertebrate species, can lead to cascading effects that alter the overall biodiversity and resilience of the wetland, which are factors considered in assessing the potential impact of increased sediment load from stormwater runoff. The correct answer is D. Explaining how disruptions to the food web, such as the decline of a key invertebrate species, can lead to cascading effects that alter the overall biodiversity and resilience of the wetland, which are factors considered in assessing the potential impact of increased sediment load from stormwater runoff. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a need to assess an environmental trainer's understanding of ecosystem structure and function, specifically in the context of regulatory compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the trainer to not only understand ecological principles, but also to apply them within a strict legal and ethical framework. Misinterpreting or misapplying these principles can lead to non-compliance, environmental damage, and reputational harm for the trainer and their organization. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly links ecological understanding to the practical requirements of environmental regulation. By focusing on how ecosystem structure, e.g., species composition, trophic levels, and function, e.g., nutrient cycling, energy flow, are impacted by regulated activities, and how these impacts are assessed and mitigated under specific environmental laws, trainer demonstrates a comprehensive and compliant understanding. This aligns with the ethical duty of an environmental professional to protect the environment while adhering to legal mandates. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on theoretical ecological concepts without considering their regulatory implications is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the core requirement of an environmental trainer, to guide others in compliant environmental practices. It represents a regulatory failure by neglecting the legal context in which ecological assessments are performed. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes economic feasibility over ecological integrity, even if it appears to meet minimum regulatory thresholds, is ethically flawed. While economic considerations are often part of environmental decision-making, they must not supersede the fundamental regulatory and ethical obligation to prevent significant environmental harm. This approach risks regulatory noncompliance if the feasibility leads to outcomes that violate the spirit or letter of environmental laws. A further incorrect approach that relies on outdated or generalized ecological models without verifying their applicability to the specific regulated site and its unique ecosystem characteristics is a failure in due diligence. Environmental regulations often require site-specific assessments. Using generalized information can lead to inaccurate impact assessments and ineffective mitigation strategies, potentially resulting in regulatory violations and environmental degradation. The professional reasoning process for similar situations involves a multi-step approach. 1. Identify the core ecological principles relevant to the situation. 2. Determine the specific environmental regulations that apply. 3. Analyze how the ecological principles inform compliance with those regulations. 4. Evaluate potential impacts of regulated activities on the ecosystem structure and function. 5. Develop strategies for assessment and mitigation that are both ecologically sound and legally compliant. 6. Continuously seek updated scientific information and regulatory guidance. Question 4. Process analysis reveals that a certified environmental trainer candidate is developing a training module on the chemical aspects of water pollution. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates an understanding of effective environmental chemistry training principles for certification? Option A. Explaining the chemical reactions involved in the formation of common water pollutants, illustrating how these reactions are monitored in compliance with relevant environmental regulations, and providing practical examples of remediation techniques that address these chemical processes. Option B. Presenting a series of historical case studies of water pollution incidents, focusing on the societal and economic impacts without delving into the specific chemical mechanisms or regulatory frameworks. Option C. Focusing exclusively on advanced theoretical concepts of chemical kinetics and thermodynamics as they apply to water systems, using complex mathematical models and equations that are not directly linked to practical pollution scenarios or regulatory compliance. Option D. Requiring trainees to memorize chemical formulas for various pollutants and their corresponding permissible concentration limits as defined by environmental standards, without explaining the underlying chemical processes or environmental consequences. The correct answer is A. Explaining the chemical reactions involved in the formation of common water pollutants, illustrating how these reactions are monitored in compliance with relevant environmental regulations, and providing practical examples of remediation techniques that address these chemical processes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental trainer to evaluate the effectiveness of different approaches to teaching complex environmental chemistry concepts to a diverse audience. The challenge lies in balancing theoretical accuracy with practical applicability and ensuring that the chosen method aligns with regulatory requirements for environmental training, which often mandate clear, understandable, and actionable information. The trainer must consider not only the scientific validity of the content, but also its pedagogical effectiveness and compliance with the specific environmental training standards relevant to the jurisdiction. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a multifaceted teaching strategy that integrates theoretical principles with real-world applications and interactive learning. This aligns with best practices in adult education and environmental training by catering to different learning styles and promoting deeper understanding. Specifically, it involves explaining the chemical processes behind environmental issues, e.g., acid rain formation, eutrophication mechanisms, demonstrating how these processes are monitored and regulated, linking to relevant environmental laws and standards, and providing practical examples of mitigation strategies that trainees can implement. This approach ensures that trainees not only grasp the scientific underpinnings, but also understand their practical implications and regulatory context, which is crucial for their role as certified environmental trainers. This method directly supports the objective of the Certified Environmental Trainer exam, which is to ensure individuals can effectively communicate and apply environmental knowledge in a compliant and practical manner. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on theoretical chemical equations and complex molecular structures without relating them to environmental impacts or regulatory compliance. This fails to meet the practical and applied nature of environmental training, potentially leaving trainees with academic knowledge, but lacking the ability to address real-world environmental issues or understand their regulatory implications. This approach is ethically and regulatorily deficient, as it does not equip trainees with the necessary skills to perform their duties effectively or to ensure compliance with environmental standards. Another incorrect approach relies entirely on anecdotal evidence and case studies without grounding them in fundamental chemical principles. While case studies are valuable, omitting the underlying chemistry can lead to a superficial understanding. Trainees might learn what happened in specific instances, but not why it happened, hindering their ability to predict or prevent similar issues in different contexts, or to understand the scientific basis of regulatory requirements. This approach is professionally inadequate because it lacks the scientific rigor expected of environmental training and may not satisfy the comprehensive knowledge requirements for certification. A third incorrect approach prioritizes memorization of chemical formulas and regulatory limits without explaining the chemical processes that lead to those limits or the environmental consequences of exceeding them. This method treats environmental chemistry as a rote learning exercise, failing to foster critical thinking or problem-solving skills. It does not enable trainees to understand the interconnectedness of chemical processes, environmental impacts, and regulatory frameworks, which is essential for effective environmental management and training. This approach is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it does not cultivate the deep understanding necessary for responsible environmental stewardship and compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes pedagogical effectiveness, scientific accuracy, and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the learning objectives and the target audience's prior knowledge and experience. 2. Identifying the core environmental chemistry principles relevant to the training topic and the applicable regulatory framework. 3. Selecting teaching methods that cater to diverse learning styles, promote active engagement, and facilitate the transfer of knowledge to practical application. 4. Continuously evaluating the effectiveness of the training and seeking feedback to refine approaches. 5. Ensuring all content is aligned with current scientific understanding and regulatory requirements of the specified jurisdiction. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal an unexpected color change when two previously distinct liquid samples are mixed in a laboratory setting. The samples are known to contain different organic compounds. Which of the following best explains the observed color change based on fundamental chemical principles? Option A. The physical process of diffusion caused the molecules to spread out, leading to a change in light scattering and thus the observed color. Option B. The increased surface area from mixing allowed for a greater interaction with ambient light, altering its perception. Option C. The temperature of the mixture increased due to the kinetic energy of the molecules, causing a shift in the visible spectrum. Option D. The mixing of the two liquids resulted in the formation of new molecules with different light absorption properties due to the rearrangement and bonding of atoms. Correct answer is D. The mixing of the two liquids resulted in the formation of new molecules with different light absorption properties due to the rearrangement and bonding of atoms. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the certified environmental trainer to interpret and apply fundamental chemical principles in a practical, quality control context. The trainer must not only understand the basic properties of atoms and molecules, but also how these properties influence chemical reactions and potential environmental impacts. The challenge lies in identifying the most accurate and relevant explanation for the observed anomaly, ensuring that the explanation aligns with established scientific understanding and regulatory expectations for environmental training. Misinterpreting the chemical basis of the anomaly could lead to ineffective training, incorrect risk assessments, and potential noncompliance with environmental regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach accurately identifies that the observed color change is due to a chemical reaction involving the interaction of specific atoms within the molecules of the two substances. This approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the underlying chemical principles at play. It correctly posits that the formation of new chemical bonds, leading to new molecules with different properties, like color, is the fundamental reason for the observed change. This aligns with the core tenets of basic chemical principles taught in environmental training, emphasizing the transformation of matter. Ethically, providing a scientifically accurate explanation is paramount for effective training and responsible environmental stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach might focus solely on the physical state of the substances, e.g., liquid mixing with liquid, without explaining the chemical transformation. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it provides an incomplete and superficial explanation. Environmental training requires understanding the chemical basis of phenomena, not just their physical appearance. Another incorrect approach might attribute the change to an external factor not supported by the provided information, such as temperature fluctuations, without establishing a causal link based on chemical reactivity. This is a failure in analytical reasoning and could lead to misdirected troubleshooting and training. A third incorrect approach might oversimplify the process by stating that the substances reacted without elaborating on the atomic and molecular interactions that constitute a reaction, such as bond breaking and formation. While not entirely false, it lacks the depth required for a certified environmental trainer to effectively convey the principles of chemical change. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should approach such situations by first identifying the observable phenomenon. Then they must recall and apply fundamental chemical principles, atoms, molecules, bonding, reactions, to explain the phenomenon. The decision-making process involves evaluating potential explanations against scientific accuracy and relevance to environmental training objectives. If an anomaly is observed, the trainer should consider: 1. What are the constituent elements and molecules involved? 2. What are the known properties and reactivity of these substances? 3. How do atomic and molecular interactions lead to observable changes? 4. Is the proposed explanation scientifically sound and understandable for the target audience? This systematic approach ensures that explanations are accurate, relevant, and contribute to effective environmental training. Question 6. The audit findings indicate a significant decline in several native insect species within a protected wetland area. Field observations reveal a substantial increase in the population of a non-native plant species that aggressively colonizes open areas and appears to be displacing native flora. While the invasive plant does not appear to be a direct food source for many native insects, its rapid growth is reducing the availability of preferred native host plants and altering the microhabitat conditions. The audit report requires a determination of the primary ecological interaction driving the native insect decline to inform management strategies. Option A. The primary ecological interaction is mutualism, where both the invasive plant and native insects benefit from their coexistence, leading to the observed decline due to unrelated environmental factors. Option B. The primary ecological interaction is predation, with the invasive plant directly preying upon native insect larvae, causing their mortality. Option C. The primary ecological interaction is parasitism, where the invasive plant hosts a parasite that specifically targets and infects native insect populations. Option D. The primary ecological interaction is interspecific competition, where the invasive plant outcompetes native flora for light, water, and nutrients, thereby reducing the availability of essential host plants and altering habitat structure critical for native insect survival and reproduction. The correct answer is D. The primary ecological interaction is interspecific competition, where the invasive plant outcompetes native flora for light, water, and nutrients, thereby reducing the availability of essential host plants and altering habitat structure critical for native insect survival and reproduction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the certified environmental trainer to interpret complex ecological interactions within a regulated context, specifically concerning the impact of invasive species on native biodiversity. The trainer must balance the scientific understanding of competition and predation with the practical and legal obligations of environmental management and reporting. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the primary ecological driver of native species decline and translating that understanding into actionable, compliant recommendations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves accurately identifying the primary ecological interaction driving the decline of native species. In this case, the invasive species is outcompeting native species for limited resources, which is a direct form of interspecific competition. This understanding is crucial for developing effective management strategies that address the root cause of the problem, aligning with regulatory requirements for biodiversity protection and invasive species control. Best professional practice dictates that environmental assessments and recommendations are grounded in sound ecological principles and directly address the identified environmental stressors. This approach ensures that remediation efforts are targeted, efficient, and compliant with environmental protection laws. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on predation by the invasive species without acknowledging the more significant competitive pressure. While predation might be occurring, if competition for resources is the primary driver of native species decline, focusing only on predation will lead to ineffective management strategies and potentially misallocate resources. This failure to accurately diagnose the ecological interaction constitutes a regulatory failure, as it impedes the effective implementation of biodiversity protection measures. Ethically, it represents a failure to provide accurate and useful guidance. Another incorrect approach might suggest that the observed decline is due to natural population fluctuations without sufficient evidence. This ignores the clear presence of an invasive species and its known ecological impacts. Such an approach would be a significant regulatory failure, as it dismisses a documented environmental threat and fails to comply with reporting and management obligations related to invasive species. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for established environmental science. A third incorrect approach could be to recommend broad-spectrum pesticide application to control the invasive species without a specific ecological justification or risk assessment. This fails to identify the specific ecological interaction, competition, and proposes a potentially harmful and non-targeted solution. This would be a regulatory failure due to the lack of a science-based approach and potential violation of regulations governing pesticide use and environmental impact assessments. Ethically, it represents a reckless and potentially damaging course of action. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach to environmental problem solving. This involves 1. Thoroughly reviewing audit findings and available data. 2. Applying established ecological principles to analyze observed phenomena. 3. Identifying the most significant ecological interactions at play. 4. Consulting relevant regulatory frameworks and guidelines for invasive species management and biodiversity protection. 5. Developing recommendations that are scientifically sound, ecologically appropriate, and legally compliant. 6. Clearly communicating the rationale behind the recommendations, including the identified ecological drivers and regulatory basis. Question 7. Market research demonstrates that a client operating in the chemical manufacturing sector requires updated environmental compliance training. The client has provided their previous training materials, which are 5 years old. The certified environmental trainer is aware that environmental regulations can change frequently. Which of the following actions best ensures the trainer is providing compliant and effective training? Option A. Immediately begin developing new training content based on the provided materials, assuming the core principles remain unchanged. Option B. Consult the most recent official publications and guidance documents from the relevant environmental regulatory agency to verify and update the training content. Option C. Ask the client to provide a summary of any recent regulatory changes they are aware of to incorporate into the training. Option D. Thoroughly review the client's provided training materials and update them based on general environmental best practices. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly review the client's provided training materials and update them based on general environmental best practices. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a trainer to balance the immediate demands of a client with the overarching legal and ethical obligations to ensure accurate and compliant environmental training. The trainer must not only impart knowledge, but also ensure that the knowledge imparted is grounded in the specific regulatory framework applicable to the client's operations. Misinterpreting or misapplying regulations can lead to significant legal penalties, operational disruptions, and reputational damage for both the client and the trainer. Careful judgment is required to identify the most relevant and current regulatory requirements and to tailor training accordingly, without overstepping the bounds of the trainer's expertise or the client's specific needs. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough and accurate understanding of the applicable environmental regulations. By consulting the most recent official publications from the relevant environmental agency, e.g., the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S., the trainer ensures that the training content is up-to-date, legally sound, and directly addresses the client's compliance obligations. This proactive verification demonstrates a commitment to regulatory accuracy and professional integrity, safeguarding the client from potential non-compliance issues and upholding the trainer's credibility. This aligns with the ethical duty of a certified environmental trainer to provide accurate and effective training based on current legal standards. An incorrect approach that relies solely on past training materials without verification fails to account for regulatory updates. Environmental laws and regulations are dynamic, and outdated information can lead to non-compliance, exposing the client to fines and legal action. This approach demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the evolving legal landscape, which is a significant professional and ethical failure. Another incorrect approach that assumes a generic understanding of environmental principles without referencing specific jurisdictional regulations is also professionally unacceptable. While general principles are important, compliance hinges on adherence to the precise requirements of the governing body. This approach risks providing training that is irrelevant or insufficient for meeting the client's specific legal obligations within their operating jurisdiction, leading to potential non-compliance and a failure to fulfill the trainer's core responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the client's specific industry, operation, and geographic location to determine the relevant environmental regulatory jurisdiction. 2. Access and review the most current official regulatory documents and guidance from the applicable environmental agency. 3. Cross-reference existing training materials with current regulations to identify any discrepancies or outdated information. 4. Develop or adapt training content to reflect the precise requirements of the applicable laws and policies. 5. Clearly communicate the scope of the training and the regulatory basis to the client, managing expectations regarding the specific compliance areas covered. 6. Maintain records of regulatory sources used for training development to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 8. The monitoring system demonstrates elevated levels of nitrates and phosphates in the surface water discharge, alongside a slight but consistent increase in turbidity, with no immediate indication of specific industrial point sources. Based on these observations, which of the following represents the most appropriate initial risk assessment approach for a certified environmental trainer? Option A. Focus solely on the turbidity readings, as this is the most visually apparent indicator of potential pollution and likely the primary concern for regulatory bodies. Option B. Immediately recommend the installation of advanced filtration systems for the discharge, assuming the elevated parameters are indicative of a significant, immediate threat requiring extensive treatment. Option C. Report the data to the regulatory agency without further analysis, as the responsibility for risk assessment lies solely with the agency. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive source identification study. Evaluate potential non-point sources, e.g., agricultural runoff, urban stormwater, and assess the risk to downstream aquatic ecosystems and potential drinking water intakes based on established water quality standards and the synergistic effects of these pollutants. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive source identification study. Evaluate potential non-point sources, e.g., agricultural runoff, urban stormwater, and assess the risk to downstream aquatic ecosystems and potential drinking water intakes based on established water quality standards and the synergistic effects of these pollutants. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the certified environmental trainer to interpret complex water chemistry data and translate it into actionable risk assessment and management strategies. The challenge lies in moving beyond simple data reporting to a proactive identification of potential environmental and health risks, necessitating a deep understanding of water properties, common pollutants, and effective treatment methods within the specific regulatory context. Trainer must also consider the implications of these findings for compliance and public safety, demanding careful judgment and a thorough grasp of the relevant legal and ethical obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment that prioritizes potential impacts based on the observed water chemistry parameters. This means evaluating the concentration of identified pollutants against established regulatory limits, e.g., EPA maximum contaminant levels or state-specific standards, and considering the potential for synergistic effects or the formation of more hazardous compounds. This approach represents best professional practice because it is proactive, data-driven, and directly addresses the core mandate of environmental protection and public health. It aligns with the principles of environmental management systems and regulatory compliance, ensuring that resources are focused on the most significant risks and that appropriate mitigation or treatment strategies are implemented in a timely manner. This demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and responsible environmental stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on reporting the raw data without any interpretation or risk assessment. This fails to meet the professional obligation of a certified environmental trainer to provide actionable insights and guidance. It represents a regulatory failure by not identifying potential noncompliance or environmental harm, and an ethical failure by neglecting the responsibility to inform stakeholders of potential risks. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a generic, one-size-fits-all treatment solution without a thorough risk assessment. This is inefficient, potentially ineffective, and could lead to unnecessary costs or even introduce new problems. It is a professional failure because it bypasses the critical step of understanding the specific nature and magnitude of the contamination. From a regulatory standpoint, it might not address the root cause or meet specific discharge or quality standards, leading to continued noncompliance. A third incorrect approach would be to dismiss the findings as insignificant without proper scientific justification or comparison to regulatory benchmarks. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a potential disregard for environmental regulations. It is a significant ethical and regulatory failure, as it could lead to the undetected release of harmful pollutants, jeopardizing public health and the environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the context of the monitoring, what is being monitored, why, and what are the potential receptors, e.g., drinking water sources, aquatic ecosystems. The next step is to compare the observed parameters against relevant regulatory standards and guidelines. This comparison forms the basis for identifying potential risks. Following this, qualitative or semi-quantitative risk assessment should be conducted, considering the likelihood and severity of potential adverse impacts. Based on this assessment, appropriate management and treatment strategies should be developed, prioritizing those that are most effective and cost-efficient while ensuring regulatory compliance. Continuous monitoring and re-evaluation are crucial to confirm the effectiveness of implemented measures. Question 9. Assessment of an industrial facility's plan to implement a new production line that will alter its air emission profiles, increase wastewater volume and change its chemical composition, and generate a new type of solid waste. The facility currently holds separate permits for air emissions, wastewater discharge, and solid waste management. Which approach best ensures compliance and minimizes implementation challenges? Option A. Proactively review all existing permits, identify potential impacts on each, and engage with regulatory agencies for all relevant permits to determine necessary modifications or new applications before commencing operational changes. Option B. Focus on obtaining approval for the air emissions permit first, and then address the wastewater and waste permits sequentially as time and resources allow. Option C. Update only the air emissions permit, as the primary change is related to emissions, and assume existing wastewater and waste permits are adequate. Option D. Proceed with the operational changes and address any permit issues that arise after the new production line is operational. The correct answer is A. Proactively review all existing permits, identify potential impacts on each, and engage with regulatory agencies for all relevant permits to determine necessary modifications or new applications before commencing operational changes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in environmental permitting, where a facility must navigate the complexities of multiple, interconnected permitting processes for air emissions, wastewater discharge, and solid waste management. The challenge lies in ensuring that the proposed operational changes are evaluated holistically across all relevant permits, preventing unintended consequences or noncompliance that could arise from a siloed approach. A critical aspect is understanding how changes in one media, e.g., air emissions, might impact requirements or limitations in another. G. Wastewater treatment or waste disposal. This requires a deep understanding of the facility's processes, the specific regulatory requirements for each permit type, and the potential for cross-media impacts. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all existing permits and a proactive engagement with regulatory agencies to understand how the proposed operational modifications will affect each permit. This includes identifying potential new emission sources, changes in wastewater characteristics or volume, and the generation of new or different waste streams. By coordinating the permitting efforts and seeking agency guidance early, the facility ensures that all regulatory requirements are met concurrently and that the operational changes are integrated into the permitting framework effectively. This proactive and integrated strategy minimizes the risk of delays, penalties, and operational disruptions, representing best professional practice by prioritizing compliance and environmental protection through thorough due diligence and interagency communication. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to only update the air permit, assuming that changes to wastewater and waste management are minor or unaffected. This fails to recognize the interconnectedness of environmental media and regulatory requirements. Ethically and regulatorily, it is a failure to conduct a complete environmental impact assessment for the proposed changes, potentially leading to violations of wastewater discharge limits or improper waste disposal, which are distinct regulatory offenses. Another incorrect approach is to assume that existing permits are sufficient without any review, relying on the belief that the operational changes are incremental. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential for cumulative impacts or new regulatory triggers. It is a regulatory failure to not assess whether the changes necessitate permit modifications or new permits, and an ethical failure to not proactively ensure environmental protection. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the most immediate or perceived critical permit, e.g., air, and defer addressing other permits until later. This creates a significant risk of operational delays and noncompliance. It is a regulatory failure to not manage all required permitting processes in a timely and integrated manner, and an ethical failure to not prioritize comprehensive environmental stewardship throughout the project lifecycle. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario should employ a systematic, integrated approach. First, thoroughly understand the proposed operational changes and their potential environmental implications across all media. Second, review all existing permits to identify relevant conditions and potential conflicts with the proposed changes. Third, engage proactively with the relevant regulatory agencies for each permit to discuss the proposed changes and understand the specific requirements for modification or new permitting. Fourth, develop a coordinated strategy for submitting all necessary permit applications or modification requests, ensuring that the interdependencies between permits are addressed. This decision-making process prioritizes comprehensive compliance, risk mitigation, and efficient project execution. Question 10. Comparative studies suggest that optimizing industrial processes to minimize air pollutant formation is more effective than solely relying on post-emission treatment. Considering the principles of air chemistry, which of the following approaches best aligns with this finding for a certified environmental trainer aiming to guide a facility towards improved environmental performance and regulatory compliance? Option A. Implementing advanced catalytic converters and scrubbers to treat emissions at the source, focusing on meeting stringent emission limits. Option B. Prioritizing the reduction of operational costs by selecting the least expensive emission control technologies available, regardless of their chemical efficiency. Option C. Relying on historical emission data and general industry best practices without investigating the specific chemical pathways of pollutant generation in the facility. Option D. Conducting a detailed analysis of the chemical reactions and atmospheric processes that lead to the formation of specific pollutants within the industrial process, and then proposing targeted modifications to the process chemistry or operating parameters to prevent or reduce their generation. The correct answer is A. Implementing advanced catalytic converters and scrubbers to treat emissions at the source, focusing on meeting stringent emission limits. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental trainer to interpret complex air chemistry processes and their implications for regulatory compliance and process optimization, without resorting to purely quantitative methods. The trainer must demonstrate a deep understanding of atmospheric reactions and pollutant behavior to guide stakeholders towards effective, compliance strategies. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core objective of process optimization through an understanding of air chemistry. It focuses on identifying and mitigating the root causes of pollutant formation and release by leveraging knowledge of atmospheric reactions, such as photochemical smog formation or the catalytic cycles involved in ozone depletion. This aligns with the principles of environmental stewardship and proactive pollution prevention, which are central to environmental training and regulatory compliance. Ethically, it promotes informed decision-making based on scientific understanding, leading to more sustainable and effective environmental management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on end-of-pipe controls without understanding the underlying chemistry fails to address the fundamental issues. This represents a regulatory failure because it may not achieve the most efficient or effective reduction of pollutants, potentially leading to non-compliance with performance standards or exceeding emission limits in the long run. Ethically, it is a failure to provide comprehensive and scientifically sound advice, potentially leading to wasted resources and continued environmental harm. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction over understanding the chemical processes is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to the selection of control technologies that are not optimized for the specific pollutants or reaction pathways, resulting in suboptimal performance and potential future compliance issues. It represents a failure to uphold the professional responsibility to ensure environmental protection, prioritizing economic factors over scientific efficacy and regulatory adherence. A further incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or outdated information about air chemistry ignores the dynamic nature of atmospheric processes and evolving regulatory requirements. This is a significant regulatory failure as it can lead to non-compliance with current standards and a lack of preparedness for future environmental challenges. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of commitment to continuous learning and professional development, which is essential for an environmental trainer. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific air quality regulations applicable to the jurisdiction. 2. Analyzing the known or suspected air chemistry involved in the pollutant formation and transport relevant to the process. 3. Evaluating potential process modifications or control strategies based on their chemical effectiveness and efficiency in reducing emissions. 4. Considering the economic feasibility and long-term sustainability of each approach. 5. Communicating the scientific rationale and regulatory implications clearly to stakeholders to facilitate informed decision-making. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates elevated levels of lead and arsenic in soil samples collected from a former industrial site. The soil composition varies across the site, with some areas exhibiting high organic matter content and others being predominantly sandy. The certified environmental trainer must advise on the most appropriate initial step for assessing the implications of these findings for potential remediation strategies. Considering the regulatory framework for contaminated sites. Option A. Focus solely on the total concentration of lead and arsenic in the soil, comparing these values directly to generic regulatory screening levels without further investigation into soil characteristics. Option B. Recommend a passive soil capping strategy for the entire site, based on the assumption that this will effectively contain the contaminants regardless of their chemical form or soil matrix interactions. Option C. Conduct a detailed analysis of soil properties, including pH, organic matter content, and texture, in conjunction with contaminant speciation and bioavailability assessments, to understand how these factors influence the mobility and potential risks of lead and arsenic. Option D. Immediately propose a standard excavation and off-site disposal plan for all areas exceeding the regulatory action levels for lead and arsenic, assuming this is the most universally compliant approach. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed analysis of soil properties, including pH, organic matter content, and texture, in conjunction with contaminant speciation and bioavailability assessments, to understand how these factors influence the mobility and potential risks of lead and arsenic. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, interpreting complex soil chemistry data to inform remediation strategies. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the extent and nature of contamination, understanding the implications of soil properties on contaminant behavior, and selecting appropriate, compliant remediation techniques. This requires a deep understanding of soil chemistry principles and their interaction with regulatory requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven assessment that directly addresses regulatory compliance and environmental protection. It involves a systematic evaluation of soil composition and properties to understand how they influence contaminant mobility and bioavailability. This understanding is crucial for selecting remediation methods that are effective, cost-efficient, and meet the specific standards set by the relevant environmental regulatory framework. Adhering to these established protocols ensures that decisions are defensible, scientifically sound, and aligned with the overarching goals of environmental stewardship and public health protection. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the presence of a specific contaminant without considering the soil matrix's influence would be a regulatory failure. It overlooks the critical role of soil properties, e.g., organic matter content, pH, texture, in determining contaminant fate and transport, potentially leading to ineffective remediation, or the selection of inappropriate technologies. Ethically, this approach fails to uphold the professional responsibility to protect the environment and human health by not conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past practices without validating them against current site-specific data and regulatory requirements is also a significant failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the scientific rigor demanded by environmental regulations. It can lead to wasted resources, prolonged environmental impact, and potential legal liabilities. Professionally, it signifies a failure to apply critical thinking and adhere to established best practices for environmental assessment and management. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the regulatory context. Identify all applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations and guidelines relevant to soil contamination and remediation. 2. Data acquisition and validation. Ensure all collected soil chemistry data is accurate, representative, and collected according to established protocols. 3. Interpret soil chemistry. Analyze soil composition, e.g., mineralogy, organic matter, and properties, e.g., pH, cation exchange capacity, texture, to understand their impact on contaminant behavior. 4. Contaminant fate and transport assessment. Evaluate how soil characteristics influence the mobility, persistence, and bioavailability of identified contaminants. 5. Risk assessment. Determine the potential risks to human health and the environment based on contaminant levels, exposure pathways, and site-specific conditions. 6. Remediation strategy development. Select remediation technologies that are effective, compliant with regulation, technically feasible, and environmentally sound, considering the soil chemistry and contaminant properties. 7. Documentation and reporting. Maintain thorough records of all assessments, decisions, and remediation activities, ensuring compliance with reporting requirements. Question 12. To address the challenge of effectively training individuals on the characteristics, distribution, and climate of global biomass, which of the following approaches best facilitates a deep and actionable understanding of these ecological systems? Option A. Describing biomass primarily by listing the dominant types of plants found in each region, as these are the most visible indicators of a biome. Option B. Explaining biomass by detailing the primary climatic factors, temperature and precipitation, that determine their characteristic vegetation, animal life, and geographical distribution. Option C. Focusing on the unique biodiversity of each biome, highlighting the variety of species present without explicitly connecting this to the underlying climatic drivers. Option D. Defining biomass based on their geographical location on the globe, without delving into the specific climatic conditions that prevail in those areas. The correct answer is B. Explaining biomass by detailing the primary climatic factors, temperature and precipitation, that determine their characteristic vegetation, animal life, and geographical distribution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a certified environmental trainer must accurately convey complex ecological concepts to a diverse audience with varying levels of scientific understanding. The challenge lies in tailoring the explanation of biomass, their distribution, and climate characteristics to be both scientifically accurate and easily comprehensible, ensuring effective knowledge transfer and promoting responsible environmental stewardship. The trainer must navigate the potential for misinterpretation and the need to connect theoretical knowledge to practical environmental management. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clarity, accuracy, and relevance by focusing on the defining climatic factors, temperature and precipitation, that drive biome characteristics and distribution. The trainer provides a foundational understanding that is scientifically sound and directly applicable to understanding global environmental patterns. This approach aligns with the ethical obligation of a certified environmental trainer to deliver accurate and accessible information, enabling trainees to make informed decisions regarding environmental protection and management. It also implicitly supports regulatory compliance by fostering a deeper understanding of the natural systems that environmental regulations aim to protect. An incorrect approach that oversimplifies biomass by focusing solely on dominant plant life fails ethically and professionally. While plant life is a characteristic of a biome, it is a consequence of climate, not its primary driver. This approach risks misinforming trainees, leading them to believe that plant species alone determine a biome, which is a significant oversimplification. It neglects the fundamental role of climate in shaping ecosystems and their distribution, potentially hindering trainees' ability to understand broader environmental issues or the impact of climate change on different biomass. Another incorrect approach that emphasizes the geographical location without detailing the underlying climatic drivers is also professionally deficient. A location is important for distribution. It is the climate of that location that dictates the biome. This approach would lead to a superficial understanding, failing to explain why certain biomass exist in specific regions. It misses the opportunity to educate trainees on the causal relationships between climate and ecosystem types, which is crucial for environmental training. This lack of depth can lead to a failure to grasp the interconnectedness of global environmental systems. A further incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on the biodiversity of a biome without linking it to its climatic characteristics is also problematic. Biodiversity is a result of the biome's conditions, not the cause of its existence or distribution. Presenting biodiversity in isolation can lead to a fragmented understanding, where trainees learn about the species present, but not the environmental context that supports them. This can impede their ability to predict how changes in climate might affect biodiversity or to understand conservation strategies that are tailored to specific biome conditions. The professional reasoning process for this situation involves first identifying the core learning objective, understanding biomass, their distribution, and climate. The trainer must then consider the audience's prior knowledge and learning styles. The most effective approach will be one that builds from fundamental principles climate to observable characteristics, vegetation, fauna, and their spatial distribution. This requires a systematic explanation that highlights cause and effect relationships. Professionals should always strive for accuracy, clarity, and relevance, ensuring that the information provided is not only correct but also actionable and understandable, thereby fulfilling their role as educators and promoters of environmental responsibility. Question 13. Benchmark analysis indicates that a new manufacturing process introduces several potential environmental hazards. As a certified environmental trainer, how should you approach the risk characterization of these hazards, specifically concerning probability and severity, to optimize your training program development? Option A. Prioritize training on the most severe potential environmental incidents, even if they are highly improbable. Prepare for worst-case scenarios. Option B. Conduct a structured assessment to evaluate both the likelihood of each hazard occurring and the potential magnitude of its environmental consequences, using this to inform training priorities. Option C. Develop training modules that focus on the most likely environmental incidents, regardless of their potential impact, to ensure frequent reinforcement of safe practices. Option D. Base training priorities on the subjective perception of risk among operational staff, focusing on what they feel is most concerning. The correct answer is C. Develop training modules that focus on the most likely environmental incidents, regardless of their potential impact, to ensure frequent reinforcement of safe practices. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a trainer to move beyond simply identifying potential environmental hazards to a more nuanced assessment of their actual risk. The core difficulty lies in translating theoretical probabilities and potential severities into actionable training strategies that are both effective and compliant with regulatory expectations for environmental trainers. The trainer must consider how to best equip trainees to understand and manage these risks in their specific operational contexts. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement to characterize risk by considering both the likelihood of an event occurring and the potential magnitude of its consequences. This allows for the prioritization of training efforts on the most significant risks, ensuring that resources are allocated efficiently and that trainees gain a practical understanding of what matters most. This aligns with the ethical obligation of an environmental trainer to provide relevant and impactful education that contributes to environmental protection and compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the probability of an event without considering its severity fails to adequately characterize risk. This can lead to overemphasis on minor but frequent events, diverting attention from less frequent but potentially catastrophic ones. This is a regulatory failure as it does not meet the comprehensive risk characterization requirements. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the severity of an event, ignoring its probability, can lead to an unrealistic focus on highly improbable, extreme scenarios. This can result in training that is perceived as alarmist or impractical by trainees, reducing engagement and the likelihood of behavioral change. Ethically, this fails to provide a balanced and realistic understanding of risk. A further incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or subjective feelings about risk, rather than a structured assessment of probability and severity, is professionally unacceptable. This lacks the rigor required for effective risk management and can lead to misallocation of training resources and a failure to address actual, quantifiable risks. This constitutes a failure in professional due diligence and regulatory compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of potential environmental incidents. This begins with identifying hazards, then assessing the probability of each hazard materializing into an incident, and subsequently evaluating the potential severity of the consequences should the incident occur. This dual assessment allows for a robust risk characterization, enabling the trainer to tailor training content and delivery methods to effectively address the most significant risks faced by the trainee's operations, thereby fulfilling both regulatory and ethical responsibilities. Question 14. Stakeholder feedback indicates a growing concern regarding potential health impacts from a newly identified industrial byproduct. As a certified environmental trainer, you are tasked with assessing the risk associated with this substance. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a comprehensive risk assessment framework, considering both the inherent toxicity of the substance and how individuals might come into contact with it? Option A. Prioritizing the elimination of the substance from the environment entirely, without a detailed assessment of its dose-response characteristics or the likelihood of human exposure, to proactively address stakeholder anxieties. Option B. Quantifying the maximum potential dose a person could receive and comparing it to established safe exposure limits, while also identifying all plausible routes of exposure, e.g., inhalation, dermal contact, ingestion, and the populations most likely to experience them. Option C. Focusing solely on the acute toxicity data of the substance to determine its immediate danger, as this is what the public is most likely to understand and be concerned about. Option D. Assuming that any detectable level of the substance in the environment poses a significant risk, regardless of the dose-response relationship or specific exposure pathways. The correct answer is B. Quantifying the maximum potential dose a person could receive and comparing it to established safe exposure limits, while also identifying all plausible routes of exposure, e.g., inhalation, dermal contact, ingestion, and the populations most likely to experience them. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a certified environmental trainer to interpret complex toxicological data and translate it into actionable risk management strategies for diverse stakeholders. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between scientific understanding of dose-response relationships and exposure pathways, and the practical, often non-technical, concerns of community members and regulatory bodies. Balancing scientific accuracy with clear, accessible communication is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment that integrates understanding of dose-response relationships and exposure pathways. This means identifying potential hazards, characterizing the dose response, assessing exposure levels and routes, and finally, characterizing the risk. This systematic process aligns with fundamental principles of environmental health and safety, ensuring that decisions are based on scientific evidence and regulatory requirements. For a certified environmental trainer, this approach is best professional practice as it directly supports the development of effective training programs and informed recommendations for risk mitigation, fulfilling the ethical obligation to protect public health and the environment. It also ensures compliance with relevant environmental regulations that mandate risk assessment for environmental hazards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the toxicity of a substance without considering the likelihood or magnitude of exposure. This fails to acknowledge that risk is a function of both hazard and exposure. Ethically, this is a failure because it can lead to either unnecessary alarm or complacency, neither of which serves the public interest. Regulationally, it bypasses the core requirements of risk assessment frameworks that necessitate exposure evaluation. Another incorrect approach would be to oversimplify the dose-response relationship, perhaps by assuming a linear relationship for all substances or ignoring threshold effects. This can lead to inaccurate risk estimations, potentially underestimating risks for sensitive populations or overestimating them for others. This is a regulatory failure as it deviates from established toxicological principles and regulatory guidance for risk characterization. Ethically, it compromises the integrity of the risk assessment and the advice provided. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize stakeholder concerns over scientific data without a proper evaluation of the scientific basis for those concerns. While stakeholder engagement is crucial, decisions must ultimately be grounded in sound scientific principles and regulatory frameworks. Ignoring scientific evidence in favor of unsubstantiated concerns can lead to misallocation of resources and ineffective risk management. This represents an ethical failure to provide objective, science-based guidance and a regulatory failure to adhere to established risk assessment methodologies. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory framework governing the environmental issue at hand. This involves identifying the relevant laws, guidelines, and standards for risk assessment and communication. Next, they should gather and critically evaluate all available scientific data, paying close attention to dose-response curves and identified exposure pathways. This scientific understanding then needs to be synthesized into a clear risk characterization. Crucially, this characterization must be communicated effectively to all stakeholders, tailoring the message to their level of understanding while remaining scientifically accurate and ethically responsible. The decision-making process should involve an iterative cycle of data gathering, analysis, communication, and feedback, ensuring that risk management strategies are both scientifically sound and practically implementable. Question 15. Governance review demonstrates a potential deviation from established waste management protocols at a manufacturing facility, raising concerns about compliance with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, regulations. The review suggests that certain hazardous waste streams may not have been properly characterized or segregated, potentially leading to improper storage and disposal. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the environmental manager to take? Option A. Inform senior management that the governance review's findings are likely an overreaction and that no immediate action is necessary, as current practices have not resulted in any reported incidents. Option B. Immediately cease all waste handling operations until a full external audit can be completed to avoid any further potential violations. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to accurately assess the extent of the deviation, consult with legal counsel specializing in environmental law, and prepare to engage with the relevant regulatory agency with a clear understanding of the facts and a proposed corrective action plan. Option D. Contact the regulatory agency immediately to report a potential violation based on the governance review's preliminary findings, without conducting an internal investigation to confirm the details. Correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to accurately assess the extent of the deviation, consult with legal counsel specializing in environmental law, and prepare to engage with the relevant regulatory agency with a clear understanding of the facts and a proposed corrective action plan. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental compliance, balancing proactive risk management with the reactive nature of enforcement actions. The core difficulty lies in interpreting the intent and scope of regulatory requirements when faced with potential violations. A governance review highlighting a potential noncompliance issue necessitates a strategic response that prioritizes accurate assessment and timely remediation to mitigate penalties and maintain operational integrity. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation to determine the extent of the potential violation and its root cause. This aligns with best professional practice by demonstrating due diligence, a commitment to compliance, and a proactive stance in addressing environmental risks. By engaging with regulatory bodies transparently and providing accurate information, the organization can often negotiate more favorable outcomes, potentially reducing fines and avoiding more severe enforcement actions. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes environmental protection and adherence to legal obligations. An incorrect approach would be to downplay or ignore the findings of the governance review. This could stem from a desire to avoid immediate costs or disruption, but it represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Ignoring potential violations demonstrates a lack of commitment to compliance and can lead to escalating penalties, reputational damage, and potentially criminal liability if the noncompliance is severe or results in environmental harm. Another incorrect approach might be to immediately admit to a violation without a proper investigation. This can lead to unnecessary penalties if the initial assessment was inaccurate or if mitigating circumstances exist. It also signals a lack of internal control and a failure to conduct a proper risk assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Acknowledging and documenting the governance review findings. 2. Initiating an immediate, objective internal investigation to confirm the nature and scope of the potential violation. 3. Consulting with legal and environmental compliance experts. 4. Developing a remediation plan based on the investigation's findings. 5. Communicating transparently with relevant regulatory authorities, presenting findings and proposed corrective actions. 6. Implementing the remediation plan and monitoring its effectiveness. Question 16. Consider a scenario where a developer plans to construct a new commercial facility on a previously undeveloped tract of land. As a certified environmental trainer, you are tasked with advising the project team on the environmental considerations. The land contains a small, intermittent stream, diverse vegetation, and evidence of various insect and bird populations. The developer is primarily concerned with the cost and timeline of the project and has asked for a streamlined environmental assessment. How should you approach identifying and evaluating the environmental components of this site to ensure regulatory compliance and responsible development? Option A. Rely on existing publicly available data and general knowledge of the region's environmental conditions to estimate potential impacts, without conducting site-specific field studies of the biotic and abiotic components. Option B. Prioritize the assessment of the stream's water quality and the general health of the vegetation, as these are the most visible environmental features, and assume that other biotic and abiotic factors will not be significantly impacted by the development. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive assessment that identifies and evaluates both the living organisms, biotic components, and the non-living physical and chemical elements, abiotic components of the site, considering their interactions and potential impacts from the proposed development, to inform mitigation strategies and ensure adherence to all relevant environmental laws. Option D. Focus the assessment primarily on the physical characteristics of the site, such as soil type and topography, and the stream's flow rate, as these are the most easily quantifiable abiotic factors that might directly influence construction logistics and costs. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive assessment that identifies and evaluates both the living organisms, biotic components, and the non-living physical and chemical elements abiotic components of the site, considering their interactions and potential impacts from the proposed development, to inform mitigation strategies and ensure adherence to all relevant environmental laws. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a development project with the long-term ecological health and regulatory compliance. The trainer must navigate the complexities of identifying and assessing both biotic and abiotic components, understanding their interdependencies, and communicating this information effectively to stakeholders with potentially conflicting priorities. The challenge lies in translating scientific understanding into actionable, compliant, and ethically sound recommendations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, science-based assessment of both biotic and abiotic factors. This aligns with the fundamental principles of environmental management and training, which emphasize understanding the entire ecosystem. By focusing on the interconnectedness of living organisms, biotic and non-living elements, abiotic like water quality, soil composition, and air temperature, the trainer ensures that potential environmental impacts are fully understood. This thoroughness is crucial for meeting regulatory requirements, which often mandate consideration of all relevant environmental components and their interactions. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to responsible environmental stewardship and informed decision-making, protecting both the environment and the long-term viability of the project by avoiding future remediation costs or legal challenges. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on easily quantifiable abiotic factors, such as soil pH or temperature, fails to acknowledge the critical role of biotic components like endangered plant species or sensitive aquatic life. This oversight is a regulatory failure because environmental regulations typically require a holistic assessment that includes biodiversity and ecosystem function. Ethically, it represents a superficial understanding of environmental impact, potentially leading to irreversible damage to ecosystems and species. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the immediate economic benefits of the development, disregarding the ecological implications of both biotic and abiotic changes, is also a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach ignores the legal obligations to protect the environment and the ethical responsibility to consider the broader societal and ecological consequences of development. It risks severe penalties, reputational damage, and long-term environmental degradation. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or outdated information about the site's environmental conditions, without conducting proper baseline studies of biotic and abiotic components, is a direct violation of due diligence requirements. Regulatory frameworks demand evidence-based assessments. Ethically, it is irresponsible to make decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate data, as this can lead to unforeseen environmental problems and harm. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the scope of the environmental assessment, ensuring it encompasses all relevant biotic and abiotic components. 2. Employing scientifically sound methodologies for data collection and analysis. 3. Consulting relevant regulatory frameworks and guidelines specific to the jurisdiction. 4. Engaging with all stakeholders to understand their perspectives and concerns. 5. Communicating findings and recommendations clearly and transparently, highlighting potential risks and mitigation strategies. 6. Prioritizing compliance and ethical considerations throughout the process. Question 17. The investigation demonstrates that a manufacturing facility, operating in a state with its own environmental protection agency, and within a municipality known for its strict environmental ordinances, is developing a new training program on hazardous waste management. The facility's environmental manager is seeking the most effective approach to ensure the training program fully addresses all applicable environmental laws and regulations. Option A. The training program should primarily focus on the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA), as it sets the national standard for hazardous waste management. Option B. The training program should be developed based on the recommendations of the facility's safety department, as they are most familiar with the day-to-day operational risks. Option C. The training program should be developed by consulting only the most recently enacted environmental regulations at any level of government to ensure it reflects current best practices. Option D. The training program should be developed by a comprehensive review of federal statutes, state environmental agency guidance, and local ordinances, ensuring compliance with the most stringent applicable requirements across all jurisdictions. The correct answer is A. The training program should primarily focus on the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA), as it sets the national standard for hazardous waste management. Explanation: the investigation demonstrates a common challenge faced by environmental trainers, navigating the complex and often overlapping jurisdictional requirements of federal, state, and local environmental laws. Facilities operations may be subject to a baseline set of federal regulations, but state and local governments can impose stricter or additional requirements based on specific environmental concerns within their borders. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying all applicable regulations, understanding their nuances, and ensuring compliance across all levels of government without creating unnecessary burdens or operational inefficiencies. This requires a deep understanding of regulatory hierarchies and the ability to interpret how different laws interact. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and systematic review of all relevant legal frameworks. By consulting federal statutes, state environmental agency guidance, and local ordinances, the trainer ensures that all applicable requirements are identified and understood. This proactive and thorough method minimizes the risk of noncompliance, which can lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and environmental harm. Adhering to the most stringent applicable standard, whether federal, state, or local, is a cornerstone of responsible environmental management and demonstrates a commitment to exceeding minimum legal obligations. This approach also fosters a culture of compliance within the organization. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on federal regulations fails to acknowledge the authority of state and local governments to enact their own environmental laws. This can lead to significant noncompliance if state or local regulations are more stringent. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting the environment and the organization from legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only the most recently enacted regulation overlooks the possibility that older, but still valid, regulations at any level of government might apply. Environmental law is not always superseded by newer legislation. Often, multiple regulations can coexist and apply simultaneously. This approach risks overlooking critical compliance obligations. An approach that relies solely on the advice of a single department, without independent verification or broader consultation, is also professionally flawed. Environmental compliance is a cross-functional responsibility. Relying on a single source of information can lead to blind spots and incomplete understanding of the full regulatory landscape. This can result in ethical breaches by failing to ensure comprehensive compliance and potentially exposing the organization to legal and financial risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the facility's operations and potential environmental impacts. 2. Conduct a thorough search for all applicable federal, state, and local environmental laws and regulations relevant to those operations. This includes consulting official government websites, agency guidance documents, and relevant statutes. 3. Analyze the identified regulations to understand their specific requirements, including any reporting, permitting, or operational standards. 4. Determine the hierarchy of regulations and identify the most stringent applicable requirements across all jurisdictional levels. 5. Develop and implement compliance strategies that meet or exceed the most stringent requirements. 6. Regularly review and update compliance programs to account for changes in regulations or facility operations. 7. Foster open communication and collaboration among relevant departments and external stakeholders to ensure a holistic understanding of compliance obligations. Question 18. Upon reviewing the potential for worker exposure to a newly identified airborne particulate manufacturing facility, which approach to assessing exposure pathways best aligns with the principles of comprehensive environmental training and regulatory compliance for a certified environmental trainer? Option A. Rely on historical exposure data from similar facilities and contaminants, assuming that the exposure profile will be largely consistent and that a detailed pathway analysis for the current site is unnecessary. Option B. Prioritize the assessment of inhalation exposure due to the airborne nature of the particulate and only consider dermal or ingestion pathways if specific data indicates significant contamination of surfaces or food sources. Option C. Focus exclusively on measuring ambient air concentrations of the particulate, as this is the most direct and quantifiable measure of exposure, and assume other pathways are negligible unless proven otherwise by extensive monitoring. Option D. Systematically evaluate all potential exposure pathways, including inhalation of airborne particles, dermal contact with contaminated surfaces or materials, and accidental ingestion through hand-to-mouth contact, considering the physical properties of the particulate and the work activities. Correct answer is B. Prioritize the assessment of inhalation exposure due to the airborne nature of the particulate, and only consider dermal or ingestion pathways if specific data indicates significant contamination of surfaces or food sources. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the certified environmental trainer to interpret and apply complex exposure assessment principles within a specific regulatory context, without resorting to simplistic or incomplete methodologies. The trainer must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of how different pathways contribute to overall exposure and how to qualitatively and conceptually assess the significance of these pathways, rather than relying on purely quantitative or easily calculable metrics. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of exposure assessment as mandated by environmental regulations. It emphasizes a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of all potential routes of exposure, inhalation, dermal, ingestion, relevant to the specific contaminant and scenario. This approach acknowledges that while quantification is often a goal, a thorough qualitative assessment of pathway significance is a critical precursor, and in many cases, sufficient for initial risk characterization and training development. It prioritizes understanding the potential for exposure and the factors influencing it, which is essential for effective training on hazard identification and control. This aligns with the ethical obligation of a trainer to provide accurate, complete, and actionable information. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on readily quantifiable data without considering all relevant pathways is professionally unacceptable. This failure represents a significant regulatory and ethical lapse because it can lead to an underestimation of risk, leaving trainees unprepared for potential hazards. For instance, ignoring dermal exposure when a chemical is known to be absorbed through the skin, or neglecting inhalation in a dusty environment, directly contravenes the precautionary principle inherent in environmental protection laws. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes only the most obvious or easily measured pathway, while overlooking less apparent but potentially significant routes, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to meet the standard of care expected of a certified environmental trainer. This can result in inadequate training materials and ultimately increased risk to individuals and the environment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the contaminant and its properties, e.g., volatility, solubility, physical state. 2. Characterize the work environment and activities, noting potential sources of release. 3. Systematically identify all plausible exposure pathways, inhalation, dermal, ingestion, relevant to the contaminant and scenario. 4. Qualitatively assess the significance of each pathway based on factors like the nature of the contaminant, the duration and frequency of exposure, and the effectiveness of existing controls. 5. Determine if further quantitative assessment is necessary based on the qualitative evaluation and regulatory requirements. 6. Develop training content that accurately reflects the identified pathways and their relative significance, emphasizing appropriate control measures. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that clients often seek cost-effective solutions for environmental compliance. A client, a manufacturing facility, is seeking to understand its compliance status with National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NOx, for particulate matter. The client suggests using a less expensive, non-EPA-approved portable monitoring device that they believe will provide good enough data, and also proposes only conducting monitoring during periods when they anticipate lower emissions, arguing this will be more representative of their typical operational impact. As a certified environmental trainer, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Advise the client that only EPA-approved monitoring methods and equipment, deployed according to established protocols and covering representative periods, can be used to assess NOx compliance, and explain the regulatory and ethical implications of non-compliance. Option B. Agree to use the client's suggested portable monitoring device and limited monitoring schedule, emphasizing that this approach will provide cost savings and likely indicate compliance, while downplaying the specific regulatory requirements for NOx monitoring. Option C. Recommend a compromise by using the non-EPA approved device for initial screening, but only if the client agrees to conduct a full, compliant monitoring program later, and suggest focusing the limited monitoring on periods of anticipated low emissions to manage costs. Option D. Inform the client that, while the suggested device and schedule are not ideal, they can be used for an informal assessment, and suggest they focus their resources on other aspects of their environmental management system rather than rigorous NOx monitoring. The correct answer is A. Advise the client that only EPA-approved monitoring methods and equipment, deployed according to established protocols and covering representative periods, can be used to assess NOx compliance, and explain the regulatory and ethical implications of non-compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits the immediate financial interests of a client against the long-term public health and environmental integrity mandated by regulatory standards. The certified environmental trainer is ethically and legally bound to uphold environmental regulations, even when it conflicts with a client's desire to minimize costs. The core of the challenge lies in navigating this conflict while maintaining professional integrity and ensuring compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes accurate data collection and adherence to established regulatory protocols for ambient air quality monitoring. This aligns directly with the Clean Air Act's objectives, which are to protect public health and welfare by setting national ambient air quality standards, NOx. By advocating for the use of EPA-approved methods and ensuring proper siting and operation of monitoring equipment, the trainer upholds the integrity of the data, which is crucial for assessing compliance with NOx and informing regulatory decisions. This approach is ethically sound as it fulfills the trainer's duty to provide accurate environmental information and uphold regulatory requirements. An incorrect approach that involves using less rigorous, non-EPA-approved monitoring equipment fails to meet the fundamental requirements for demonstrating compliance with NOx. This is a regulatory failure because the Clean Air Act and associated EPA guidance specify approved methodologies for ambient monitoring. Ethically, it is a failure to provide competent and accurate services, potentially misleading the client and regulatory agencies. Another incorrect approach, which involves selectively reporting only the data that meets the client's desired outcome, constitutes a severe ethical and regulatory violation. This is a deliberate misrepresentation of environmental conditions. It undermines the purpose of ambient monitoring, which is to provide an objective assessment of air quality. Such an action is a direct breach of professional integrity and can lead to significant legal penalties and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying or obfuscating the monitoring process to avoid exceeding NOx, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of transparency and a willingness to circumvent regulatory requirements. It is an ethical failure to act in good faith and a regulatory failure to comply with the spirit and letter of environmental laws. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory framework. In this case, U.S. EPA regulations for NOx and ambient monitoring, a commitment to ethical conduct, and a proactive approach to client education. When faced with a conflict between client desires and regulatory requirements, the professional should 1. Clearly articulate the legal and regulatory obligations to the client, explaining the rationale behind the standards and monitoring requirements. 2. Propose compliant and scientifically sound solutions, even if they are more costly. 3. Document all communications and recommendations thoroughly. And 4. Be prepared to disengage from the client if they insist on non-compliant or unethical practices. Question 20. Examination of the data shows that a manufacturing company is seeking to implement an ISO 14001 environmental management system, EMS. The company has a traditional hierarchical structure with distinct operational departments, e.g., production, maintenance, logistics, and a small, newly formed EHS, Environment, Health and Safety team. The primary goal is to achieve ISO 14001 certification within 18 months, while ensuring the EMS is effectively integrated into daily operations and drives tangible environmental improvements. Which of the following implementation approaches is most likely to achieve these objectives and represent best professional practice? Option A. Focus exclusively on developing comprehensive documentation and procedures for the EMS, prioritizing the creation of a robust manual and record-keeping system, with limited emphasis on operational integration or staff training beyond basic awareness. Option B. Establish a dedicated ISO 14001 project team composed solely of external consultants to design, document, and manage the entire EMS implementation process, with minimal involvement from internal staff. Option C. Create a large, centralized environmental department with extensive resources and authority to dictate all environmental procedures and compliance requirements across the entire organization, with operational departments primarily acting as implementers of directives. Option D. Empower departmental managers to lead the implementation within their respective areas, supported by the EHS team for guidance, training, and system oversight, ensuring environmental responsibilities are integrated into existing job functions and performance reviews. The correct answer is D. Empower departmental managers to lead the implementation within their respective areas, supported by the EHS team for guidance, training, and system oversight, ensuring environmental responsibilities are integrated into existing job functions and performance reviews. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in implementing ISO 14001, balancing the need for robust environmental management with the practical constraints of an existing operational structure. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the environmental management system, EMS, is not merely a documentation exercise, but is genuinely integrated into daily operations and decision-making, thereby achieving the intended environmental improvements and compliance. Careful judgment is required to select an implementation strategy that is both effective and sustainable for the organization. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the integration of the EMS into existing management processes and roles. This aligns with the core principles of ISO 14001, which emphasizes a systematic approach to environmental management that is part of an organization's overall strategic planning and operational activities. By assigning responsibility to departmental managers and providing them with the necessary training and resources, the organization fosters ownership and accountability at the operational level. This ensures that environmental considerations are embedded in day-to-day activities, leading to more effective identification of environmental aspects, implementation of controls, and achievement of environmental objectives. This approach also supports the continuous improvement cycle, Plan-Do-Check Act, inherent in ISO 14001, as departmental managers are best placed to monitor performance and identify opportunities for enhancement within their areas. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on creating a dedicated environmental department without integrating it into existing structures fails to embed environmental responsibility throughout the organization. This can lead to the EMS becoming siloed, with environmental concerns being perceived as the sole responsibility of the new department, rather than a shared organizational commitment. This can result in a lack of buy-in from other departments and a disconnect between the EMS and actual operational practices, undermining the effectiveness of the system and potentially leading to non-compliance with environmental regulations. Another incorrect approach that relies on external consultants to solely develop and manage the EMS, without significant internal involvement or training, creates dependency and a lack of internal capacity. While consultants can provide valuable expertise, the ultimate responsibility for the EMS lies with the organization. Without internal ownership and understanding, the system is unlikely to be sustained or effectively maintained once the consultants depart. This can lead to a superficial implementation that does not address the organization's specific environmental challenges or foster a culture of environmental responsibility. A further incorrect approach that treats ISO 14001 implementation as a purely documentation-driven exercise, without a clear link to operational improvements or strategic objectives, misses the fundamental purpose of the standard. The focus on paperwork over practical application can lead to an EMS that is technically compliant but ineffective in achieving tangible environmental benefits or preventing pollution. This approach fails to leverage the EMS as a tool for strategic advantage and continuous improvement, potentially leading to missed opportunities for resource efficiency and risk reduction. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the organization's current structure, culture, and resources. It requires understanding the specific environmental aspects and impacts relevant to the organization's operation. The chosen implementation strategy should be one that fosters integration, accountability, and continuous improvement, ensuring that environmental management becomes an intrinsic part of how the organization operates, rather than an add-on. This involves engaging stakeholders at all levels, providing adequate training and resources, and establishing clear lines of responsibility and communication.